The stagecoach driver, a man whose weary face was a road map of dust and disappointment, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. He didn't look at her, not directly, but at the imposing wall of green and rock that loomed before them, the trail a mere scratch leading into its heart. He gestured with a thumb toward the unseen destination. "This is as far as I go. His place is up there. Follow the path. Can't miss it." Liwa clutched the small, cloth-wrapped bundle that held all her worldly possessions, the plain white of her prairie dress a stark and vulnerable flag against the wilderness. The driver finally turned his gaze on her, and it was filled with a thick, syrupy pity that made her skin crawl. "Listen, girl, a word of advice. When he frightens you, and he will, you run. You run fast and you don't look back. The last 4 didn't even make it to sunrise on the second day. None of 'em last a week." He grunted, shaking his head as if she were already a ghost, another failed transaction. Just a waste of everyone's time. He heaved himself back onto his seat without another word, the crack of his whip a final, sharp judgment that echoed in the sudden silence. The stagecoach rattled away, leaving her in a cloud of dust and the overwhelming scent of pine. She stood alone, a tiny figure at the foot of the immense mountain, the whispers from the town still ringing in her ears, the stares, the crude speculation about the monster in the hills and the string of brides who had fled from him in terror. She took a breath, the thin, cool air a shock to her lungs. Then, placing one foot in front of the other, she began the long walk up the trail, away from a world that had sold her, and towards a man who, by all accounts, was something less than human. The path was steep and unforgiving, stones shifting under her feet, the silence of the forest broken only by the chittering of unseen creatures and the frantic beating of her own heart. The cabin appeared suddenly, emerging from a thicket of aspen and fir, as if it had grown from the earth itself. It was a rugged, formidable structure of dark, heavy logs, with a stone chimney breathing a lazy curl of smoke into the afternoon sky. It was larger than she had expected, and more menacing. As she hesitated at the edge of the clearing, the door creaked open. The man who emerged filled the entire frame, a giant of a man whose sheer size seemed to bend the light around him. His hair and beard were a wild, untamed mane, the color of dark earth and shot through with threads of gray. He wore animal skins, crudely stitched, and his arms, bare to the elbow, were thick with muscle and corded with veins. He was everything the whispers had promised, a beast, a savage. He said nothing. His eyes, buried deep beneath a heavy brow, were shadowed and impossible to read. He simply watched her, his stillness more unnerving than any roar. Liwa felt a tremor of fear run through her, a cold echo of the driver's warning. But she did not run. She met his gaze, held it for a long, silent moment, and then gave a small, formal bow of her head. It was the only gesture she could think to make, a fragile bridge of civility across the chasm of their differences. Jasper, for that was his name, merely grunted, a low rumble in his chest. He stepped aside, a silent invitation into the dim interior of the cabin. She walked past him, careful not to brush against his massive form. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, cured meat, and something else, something wild and lonely. The space was sparse, dominated by a huge stone hearth where a small fire crackled. A rough-hewn table and 2 stools were the only furniture, save for a pile of furs in a corner that served as a bed. It was a place of stark survival, not comfort. Without a word, she set her small bundle on the floor, took off her bonnet, and looked around until she found a worn broom propped against the wall. She began to sweep, the rhythmic scrape of bristles on wood a small, steady sound against the suffocating silence. It was a beginning. The days that followed fell into a pattern governed not by words but by the rising and setting of the sun. Jasper would be gone before she awoke, melting into the pre-dawn gloom. He would return in the evenings, a brace of rabbits or a fat grouse slung over his shoulder, which he would drop silently by the door. In the space between his departure and his return, Li Hua made the cabin her own. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed faintly, aired out the musty furs in the bright summer sun, and organized the meager collection of pots and pans. She discovered a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds. Patiently she cleared it, her hands sinking into the rich, dark soil, and found the faint, stubborn remnants of wild herbs and sturdy root vegetables. She began to tend to it, coaxing life back into the forgotten plot. They rarely spoke. Their communication was one of gestures and shared tasks. When he brought water from the stream in 2 heavy wooden buckets, she would take one from him, her small frame straining under the weight, but her determination unwavering. One afternoon she saw him sitting outside, wrestling with a thick needle and sinew, trying to mend a long tear in a heavy winter coat made of dark fur. His massive fingers, so adept at tracking and hunting, were clumsy and ill-suited for the delicate work. He grumbled in frustration, nearly snapping the needle. Li Hua watched him for a moment from the doorway. Then she approached quietly. She held out her hand. He looked at her, then at her small, slender fingers, and after a long pause, he surrendered the coat and the needle. She sat on the cabin step and began to stitch, her movements quick and precise, the needle weaving a neat, strong seam where there had been a ragged gash. He did not return to his own tasks. He stood nearby, a silent, hulking shadow, and watched her work until she was finished. When she handed it back to him, his fingers brushed hers, the calloused roughness of his skin a surprising contrast to the gentleness of the touch. The axe was a formidable tool, its head heavy and its handle worn smooth from another's grip. It was not his, the massive one he used to fell trees, but a smaller one she found leaning against the woodpile. It was still too large for her, but she was determined. She had watched him split logs with an effortless, fluid power, and she knew the kindling box inside would soon be empty. Lifting the axe high over her head, she brought it down with all her might. It bounced off the round of wood with a dull thud. She tried again, her arms aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jasper appeared in the doorway of the cabin, drawn by the clumsy sounds. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed over his immense chest, watching her struggle. There was no mockery in his expression, only a quiet, inscrutable observation. Sweat beaded on her brow. She adjusted her grip, focused on a crack in the wood, and swung again. This time the axe bit deep, and with a satisfying crack the wood split in 2. A small smile of triumph touched her lips. She did not look at him, but she could feel his gaze upon her as she gathered the pieces. That evening the silence was different. It felt less like a wall and more like a shared space. As she ladled a stew of rabbit and wild vegetables into his bowl, he spoke. The words were gravelly, as if dragged up from a deep, unused well. The others, they screamed. Li Hua paused, the ladle hovering over the pot. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not a monster, but a man braced for a familiar reaction. She understood. They had seen his size, his wildness, the raw, untamed power of his existence, and they had been terrified. They had filled the silence with their own fears. She placed his bowl on the table, and then her own. She sat down opposite him and picked up her spoon. She did not scream. She did not flinch. She simply met his gaze with a quiet stillness, and then began to eat. Her silence was not empty. It was an answer, a statement of fact. I am still here. I am not afraid of you. A sudden, violent summer squall broke over the mountain one night, the wind howling like a wounded animal, and the rain lashing against the cabin in furious sheets. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the log walls. Li Hua, lying on her simple pallet of blankets near the hearth, was startled awake not by the storm, but by a sound from the other side of the room. It was a choked, guttural cry, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. In a flash of lightning that illuminated the cabin's interior, she saw Jasper. He was thrashing in his bed of furs, his massive body contorted, one hand clutching at his chest as if to rip the heart from it. His face, usually a mask of stoic control, was twisted in a grimace of profound suffering. He was not the fearsome mountain man of town legend. He was a man drowning in a nightmare. The raw pain in his voice cut through her fear. Quietly, she rose and lit a small lamp, its gentle glow pushing back the frantic, strobing shadows of the lightning. He jolted awake with a gasp, his eyes wide and wild with disorientation. He saw her then, standing a few feet away, holding the lamp, her expression not one of terror, but of deep, aching compassion. The wildness in his eyes subsided, replaced by a raw, exposed vulnerability. He sat up, his broad shoulders slumped in defeat, and in the quiet space between the thunderclaps, he began to talk. The words came out in broken, jagged pieces, like shards of a shattered life. He spoke of another cabin on another mountain, of a wife with hair like spun sunlight, of a small son with his mother's laugh. He spoke of a fire, not a wildfire, but one set by greedy men from a mining company who wanted the water rights to his creek. He had been away, trading furs. He had come home to an inferno. The scars she had glimpsed on his back and hands when he bathed in the creek suddenly burned in her memory. They were not from fighting bears, but from a desperate, futile attempt to pull his family from the flames. The other women had fled from this, not from his anger, but from the sheer crushing weight of his grief. It was a sorrow too vast to live beside, a ghost that haunted the very air he breathed. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the world washed new. So too had a storm passed between them, clearing the air of unspoken questions and unfounded fears. The confession had not broken him. It had, in some strange way, begun to mend them both. The silence that returned was different. It was no longer a void, but a comfortable quiet, filled with a shared understanding of loss. Li Hua knew what it was to lose a family, to be adrift in a world that did not want you. His grief had a name, a shape, and it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a kinship. Their routine continued, but it was now threaded with small, almost imperceptible acts of tenderness. He began to leave things for her on the rough-hewn table. A perfectly formed feather from a blue jay, a handful of sweet wild strawberries, a single, startlingly beautiful columbine he'd found high on a ridge. They were offerings, silent apologies for the sorrow he carried. She, in turn, found ways to bring comfort to his life. She learned the herbs that eased the ache in his old injuries, brewing them into a bitter tea he drank without complaint. She baked bread, filling the cabin with a warm, comforting aroma that seemed to chase away the lingering scent of smoke and sorrow. One afternoon, as she sat mending one of his shirts, she began to hum, a soft, melancholic lullaby from her homeland. She stopped abruptly, embarrassed when she realized he was standing in the doorway, listening. He didn't move. "Don't stop," he rumbled, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. She hesitated, then continued, her voice growing a little stronger. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the deep lines of pain on his face seemed to soften. The cabin, once a symbol of her exile, was transforming. The sturdy log walls no longer felt like a prison, but a sanctuary. The fire in the hearth was not just for survival, but for warmth, and the enormous, silent man was no longer a beast to be feared, but a man with a wounded heart that was, ever so slowly, beginning to heal alongside her own. The arrival of Mr. Finch was a jarring intrusion, a discordant note in the quiet harmony they had built. He appeared at the edge of the clearing one late summer morning, his town clothes looking fussy and out of place against the rugged backdrop of the forest. He was not alone. Two large, sullen-looking men flanked him, their hands resting near the pistols on their hips. Finch had clearly come expecting to find a damsel in distress, or worse. He had allotted more than enough time for Jasper's monstrous reputation to drive Li Hua away, and her failure to reappear in town was cause for what he publicly termed grave concern, but privately considered a frustrating business complication. His jaw dropped when he saw her. She was on her knees in her small but thriving garden, her white dress smudged with dirt, her face glowing with health and framed by loose strands of dark hair that had escaped her braid. She was not terrified. She was not even thin. She was content. He strode forward, his polished boots trampling a patch of mint. "Good heavens, child, are you all right? We came to rescue you." Li Hua rose slowly, brushing the soil from her hands. She looked from Finch's florid, agitated face to the two grim men behind him. Her calm was a stark contrast to his manufactured panic. "I do not need rescuing, Mr. Finch." The cabin door opened and Jasper filled the space, his presence instantly shifting the power dynamic in the clearing. He was larger and far more intimidating than Finch's hired muscle. He said nothing, but his eyes, cold and hard as river stones, were fixed on the unwelcome visitors. Finch, momentarily flustered, puffed out his chest. "Nonsense! You're clearly being held here against your will by this brute. We've heard the stories. Everyone has. It's a miracle you're still alive." His gaze swept the clearing, taking in the neat woodpile, the clean-swept porch, and the scent of baking bread that drifted from the open cabin door. This was not the scene of horror he had imagined, and it clearly infuriated him. "This is no place for a delicate thing like you," Finch insisted, his voice dripping with a condescending sympathy that made Li Hua's spine stiffen. "A woman needs civilization, protection, not this wilderness. This beast will break you." He took a step toward her, reaching out as if to take her arm and lead her away from her own life. "Come now, we'll take you back to town. We'll find a proper place for you." Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, Jasper moved. It was not a violent or aggressive motion, but it was shockingly fast for a man his size. He simply stepped between them, a silent, immovable wall of muscle and fur. He didn't speak a word. He didn't have to. His body was a clear and absolute statement. You will not touch her. Finch and his men took an involuntary step back, their bluster momentarily failing them in the face of such quiet, physical certainty. But it was Li Hua who shattered the tense standoff. She stepped out from behind Jasper, placing herself at his side. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it resonated with a strength that commanded attention, a strength forged in silence and solitude. "This is my home." The words were simple, but they were unequivocal. Finch stared at her dumbfounded. "Your home? Child, you are confused. This is a cage. He is your keeper." Li Hua shook her head, a small, firm gesture. The fear she had felt on her first day was a distant memory, burned away by the steady warmth of shared days and quiet understanding. She was no longer the frightened, abandoned girl left at the bottom of the trail. She was a woman standing on her own ground, beside a man she had chosen. "You are mistaken," she said, her gaze clear and direct. The two hired men shifted uncomfortably, their purpose for being there suddenly feeling muddy and wrong. They had come to rescue a victim, but the woman before them was anything but. Finch, recovering his composure, let out a dismissive scoff. "He's a monster, girl. A savage who hides from decent folk because he knows he doesn't belong among them. What has he done to you? What has he threatened you with to make you say such things?" The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. Jasper tensed, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but Li Hua placed a gentle hand on his forearm, and the sound died in his throat. She looked directly at Mr. Finch, her eyes holding no fear, only a profound and weary pity for his ignorance. "He is a good man," she stated, the simple truth of it silencing Finch's tirade. "His heart is broken, not cruel." She spoke then, not just to Finch, but to the two men with him, her voice painting a picture they could not have imagined. She spoke of his nightmares, of the family he had lost. She did not share the details. That story was his and his alone. But she spoke of his grief, a sorrow so immense it had driven him into isolation. She told them of his quiet kindnesses, the wild flowers left on the table, the way he made sure the wood box was always full, the silent companionship that had healed her own lonely spirit. "You see a monster," she finished, her voice softening, "because you have not looked. You see a cage because you do not understand what it is to build a home." Her words, delivered with such unwavering conviction, landed with the force of a physical blow. Finch's righteous anger crumbled into a sour, impotent frustration. His narrative had been stolen from him, rewritten by the very victim he had come to save. His hired men looked away, their expressions a mixture of shame and awe. They had come to intimidate a brute, and had instead been humbled by the fierce loyalty of a woman in a dirt-smudged dress. Defeated, Finch muttered a curse under his breath and turned, stalking back down the trail without another word. His men, after a final, hesitant glance at the couple standing together by the cabin, followed him, their retreat a silent admission that they had profoundly misjudged everything. The dust from their departure settled, and the familiar, peaceful quiet of the mountain reclaimed the clearing. The air felt lighter, cleansed. Li Hua watched them go until they were swallowed by the trees, then turned to face Jasper. The hard, protective mask he wore in the presence of others had fallen away. He was looking at her, and for the first time she could see past the grief and the solitude, deep into the man himself. His eyes, the color of moss and damp earth, were filled with a profound, overwhelming emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. It was gratitude, yes, but it was woven through with something deeper, something warmer and more vulnerable. It was a look of pure, unshielded adoration. Slowly, as if afraid the moment was a dream he might shatter, he lifted his hand. It was not the clumsy, grasping hand of a brute, but the careful, reverent hand of a man who had forgotten the feeling of a gentle touch. His calloused thumb traced the line of her cheek, his touch surprisingly soft against her skin. It was a question, a prayer, and an acceptance all at once. Li Hua did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a silent answer that spoke volumes, closing her eyes and letting the simple, profound connection between them anchor her. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged peaks, bathing the cabin and the small clearing in a warm, honeyed light. The world beyond this mountain, with its cruel judgments and harsh transactions, faded into irrelevance. Here, in this small pocket of wilderness, they had found what both had been denied, a place to belong. They were two solitary souls who had found their reflection in each other, two broken halves made whole not by grand proclamations, but by the steady, healing rhythm of a life built together, one stitch, one shared meal, one quiet moment at a time. The future remained an unwritten path, but standing there, bathed in the golden light of dusk, they knew they would finally walk it together.